The following recording is a program of the World War I Historical Association. This special ongoing series commemorates the centennial of the First World War.
This is Dana Lombardi for the World War I Historical Association. On October 2nd and 3rd of 2015, a Collaboration Symposium was held between the WW1HA and the League of World War I Aviation Historians. This series presents the seminars offered at that symposium.
Thank you, Sal, for the kind invitation or cajoling to participate on the panel of experts in the symposium. Thank you, Steve, for all your guidance and support, and I appreciate the opportunity to appear here. The Gallipoli campaign has been one of the most studied campaigns of World War I. The argumentative clashes between First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill, First Sea Lord John Jackie Fisher, and Field Marshal the Lord Herbert Horatio Kitchener in the months leading up to the campaign and the subsequent land campaigns on the Gallipoli Peninsula, or the artillery and heavy ammunition shortage crisis of 1915, are all worthy topics for in-depth examination. Each of them by themselves could take up 40 minutes, but I just want to warn you, those three topics are outside the purview of the focus of my talk today. This presentation will be limited to the naval and aviation aspects of the British attempt to force the Dardanelles Strait, support military operations on the Gallipoli Peninsula, and disrupt Ottoman Empire shipping in the Sea of Marmara, and the German-Ottoman efforts to counter those operations. Lacking adequate doctrine, lacking adequate equipment, sufficient training, and experienced senior leadership, the naval forces of the Triple Entente allies and the Royal Flying Corps, Royal Naval Air Service, and the Aeronautique Militaire, as well as their German and Ottoman counterparts, slowly adapted during the campaign. Both sides would increase their proficiency in air and submarine operations as the campaign progressed, while other aspects of naval operations, such as shore bombardment, would remain deficient.
Not sure what happened, but good luck. I'd say leave it on there.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Steve. The Dardanelles is the southern strait of a waterway that links the Aegean in the west to the Black Sea in the east, via the Sea of Marmara and the Bosphorus. The ancient city of Constantinople, modern Istanbul, straddles the route. The Dardanelles Strait is about 38 miles long, measured from the tip of the Gallipoli Peninsula to the village of Gallipoli, modern-day Jalubulu, where the Sea of Marmara starts. The strait's a maximum of 4 miles wide, 330 feet deep at its deepest point. The strait has 3 key choke points. Capes Point, 3,300 yards across. The Narrows, 1,400 yards across. And Nagara Point, about 2,300 yards apart. Capes, the Narrows, Nagara. Capes, the Narrows, Nagara. A strong surface current of up to 3 knots runs down toward the Aegean westerly direction, but a strong subsurface current runs in the opposite direction, and both the British And the German submarine commanders during the campaign noticed this and used it to their advantage to avoid the minefields and as a thermocline layer to rest their crews. The campaign forced the Dardanelles and support operations ashore on the Gallipoli Peninsula, February 15th, 1915 to January 1916, was Britain's first attempt to at opposed landings on an enemy shore since 1801 at Alexandria. The Royal Navy's efforts to force the Dardanelles and threaten Constantinople in 1915 actually had historical precedents in 1807 and 1878. In February 1807, Admiral Sir John Duckworth led a fleet of 10 men of war in a run past the Dardanelles forts toward Constantinople. Neither the forts nor the ships received heavy damage in the exchange of fire. Duckworth's ships made it all the way up through the Sea of Marmara and stood off Constantinople. They didn't attack or bombard the city, they were waiting for the Ottomans to surrender. That didn't happen, and they went back down the straits and suffered the fire of the forts at the entrance again. In a letter to Russian Admiral Senyavin, Admiral Duckworth prophetically stated, quote, "The cooperation of a land force was necessary." After the British expedition, the Ottomans added 3 more forts on both shores of the strait. In 1878, Admiral Geoffrey Hornsby was ordered by the Admiralty to move through the Dardanelles and anchor off Constantinople during a conflict between the Ottomans and the Russians, whose troops were already on the Gallipoli Peninsula. Hornsby's ships, again, as his predecessor, had proceeded through the Dardanelles, again anchored off Constantinople. After the Treaty of San Stefano ended that conflict between the Ottomans and the Russians, the British ships withdrew. Admiral Hornsby understood the difficulty of moving ships past the Dardanelle forts and supplying a fleet that had reached the Sea of Marmara. Writing to the First Lord of the Admiralty, William Henry Smith, Hornsby asserted, quote, "There seems to be an idea that this fleet can keep the Dardanelles open. Nothing can be more visionary. Not all the fleets in the world can keep them open for unarmored ships. Small earthworks on the cliffs would always prevent their passage. Guns thus placed could not fail to stop transports and colliers." Throughout the 19th century, British and French engineers worked with the Ottomans to upgrade the fortifications along the Dardanelles shores. The Ottoman military purchased 134 coastal defense guns from Krupp in a variety of sizes, 6 inches, 8 inches, 9.5, 10.4, 11.2, and 14.2 inches. They were really interested in those coastal defense guns. Floating mines were added to the Dardanelles defenses in the late 1870s and 1880s. Shore-launched torpedoes drew an interest in the Ottoman leaders as early as the 1880s, and were subsequently installed in several locations on both the Asiatic and European shores. Now, in this particular photo, these are 210 millimeter Krupp coastal defense guns, earthen forts. This is on the European shoreline at the Narrows, and the mist at the top of the photo is the far shore, the Asiatic shore. At that point, only about 1,400 yards across. Very little maneuver room for naval vessels. The British Royal Naval College at Greenwich, established in 1873, and the latter Royal Navy War College, established in 1900, did not adequately address challenges of shore bombardment by naval vessels. The primary focus of gunnery instruction in the Royal Navy at this time was ship versus ship gunnery. Furthermore, neither the Royal Navy course for senior officers or the Army Staff College at Camberley, the primary staff course for the British officers, had adequate coursework addressing planning considerations necessary for efficient joint Army-Navy operations or combined operations in cooperation with armed forces of other countries. Expeditionary warfare may be defined simply as the deployment of a state's military to fight abroad, especially away from established bases. That's an entirely different planning process than just simply transportation of troops and equipment from a home port or base to a port of debarkation, as an example, the movement of the BEF from England to France in the opening month of the war. Landing troops in an opposed landing upon an enemy shore and supporting those troops with adequate naval gunfire support, minesweeping, and logistics over the shore operations, including proper medical evacuation, are all things that need to be rolled into the staff planning process. In 1904, the first decade of the 20th century, you have recommendations by various committees in England that they really need to, yes, they're modernizing their ships in their construction program, but they really need to adjust and improve and modernize their doctrine. Now, Colonel Henry Rawlinson, after being appointed as Commandant of the Staff College at Camberley, suggested that the Army officers needed to learn how to work with the Navy officers to conduct amphibious operations. The following year, the problem is with the Army Staff Course, there were very few officers attending it. So the knowledge, once they started preaching this doctrine, wasn't really well disseminated. Now, the following year recommended, in 1905 rather, a Joint Army-Navy Committee report recommended the need for a common amphibious doctrine between the Army and Navy. In 1911, the War Office published a Manual of Combined Naval and Military Operations. And General Sir Ian Hamilton, in his post as General Officer Commanding Mediterranean and Inspector General of Overseas Forces, was tasked with developing methods of translating that Army manual's doctrine into practical use by the Army. The first edition of the manual, though, didn't address what happens when you're having to force your way ashore against a contested enemy shoreline. It was basic. The first edition was more, okay, you anchor offshore, show a force, and then you unload your supplies. Hamilton spent the next few years trying to implement these. Now, Hamilton had been an observer in the Russo-Japanese War. He observed what happened at like Port Arthur and whatnot when you have onshore artillery really wreak havoc against naval vessels right offshore. By 1913, the year before the war breaks out, Hamilton actually orders a 3-battalion amphibious exercise on Malta to practice these new techniques. Really small, not a lot of officers were exposed to it, but he's thinking about it. By the start of the war, he really is the foremost expert on amphibious operations in the world. Now, the problem is, so many of the military leaders, both in the Army and Navy for Great Britain, had their experience from the latter part of the 19th century. They fought in small wars in Africa, India, China, and only a few people are contemplating, how do you integrate airplanes into modern doctrine? Airships, spotting balloons. These staff planning procedures would need to expand, and it's a painful learning curve for them. Now, in addition, maintenance and logistics, that had to be planned for. Reconnaissance, so many different things integrating the new technologies and new weapon systems had to be thought about. But the way the British military operated, it was based on seniority. So officers were plugged into roles and areas of responsibility based on their seniority, not upon any special training they'd had or competency in any of these new skill sets that were demanded and required. Now, the strategic setting for the campaign. The Ottoman Empire had been badly defeated in the Balkan Wars, 1912-1913. Germany afterwards had sent a military mission to train up the Ottoman forces. The British, at the same time, had a naval training mission that was trying to build up the Ottoman Navy. Now, the British, at the start of hostilities in Europe, the Ottomans are neutral initially, and the British training mission actually is confined to barracks in Constantinople for the first few months before they're evacuated. The head of the British naval mission, Admiral Alfred Limpus, should have been named once they decide to do an expedition against Gallipoli in Constantinople and the Dardanelles, should have been, because of his subject matter expertise and knowledge of the defenses at Gallipoli, had been named to it. But the British, their attitude is, well, that wouldn't be sporting. You know, he knows too much about it. You know, we need to have somebody that wasn't like working with them the last few years. I don't understand. At the same time, the Germans, right after the conflict breaks out in Europe in September of 1914, send Admiral Guido von Usedom down to Constantinople to improve the Gallipoli defenses on the Gallipoli Peninsula. In the Balkans War, the Gallipoli Peninsula had been heavily fortified at that narrow neck at Belair, but those defenses faced north toward the mainland, not seaward defenses. And von Usedom is given the title Inspector General of Coastal Fortifications and Minefields, and really sets to work with about 400 engineers improving the defenses. Of course, we know from your study of the conflict, by the end of 1914, fighting in Europe had bogged down to trench warfare, and the War Council in Britain is looking for how do we break the stalemate? And you have two schools of thought in the British senior political and military leadership. One is saying, well, just throw more resources at the Western Front, that's gotta work. And another is saying, we have to focus our efforts elsewhere. You know, Churchill goes round and round with Fisher, hey, let's do an operation against the German islands, or do a landing on the Baltic coast of northern Germany. The Admiralty is like, that's not going to work. So the one thing I'd forgotten to mention, the Gebben and the Breslau. One of the things that von Usedom really improves, these are all forts that had been there in the 1800s, but he improves telephone communication between the forts. He adds a howitzer zone, a southern howitzer zone in here. They and implements a number of other additions to the defenses. The Gebben and Breslau, we all know, had been in the Mediterranean at the beginning, at the outbreak of hostilities. They had escaped to Constantinople. But they are one of the instigating factors why the British decided to go ahead and launch an expedition against the Dardanelles. Gebben, 11-inch main armament, 10 11-inch guns. It's viewed as a threat to the Mediterranean squadron. So you need to, in the British thinking, force the Dardanelles, engage the Gebben in the Sea of Marmara, defeat it, and hopefully you'll overcome the Ottoman resistance. They'll capitulate, and you can open up that route for munitions to flow to Russia and for Russian wheat to flow to the west. And you'll have the side benefit of all those southeastern European countries coming to the aid of the allies, Greece, Bulgaria, Romania. That was the theory, and even though Churchill, in a 1906 report, had agreed with the committee that had basically said, you cannot use just the Navy alone to force the Dardanelles. You needed a combined Army-Navy operation, and it's very unlikely to succeed. Churchill himself had signed off on that in 1906, and here, a few years later, he's flipped 180 degrees and is cheerleading. Some modern historians in their analysis call it "do something-itis." Throwing all the force of his energetic will into the War Council meetings. These War Council meetings, when you read about them, your blood pressure rises. They are so dysfunctional. They cannot stay on topic. It's a bunch of adults with ADD, you have to actually chart out the number of flip-flops that Kitchener, Fisher, and Churchill do in the planning months, December 14 through February, March of 15. Because, which way is the wind blowing today? Another thing, the British planners, of course all we have to do is show up an anchor off Constantinople. We understand these rules of warfare. We won't bombard the city. They'll capitulate when they see the fleet and we show the flag. They're obviously disregarding the Turkish operation that had assembled in January and February of 1915 and then marched from Gaza across the Sinai, dragging assault boats with them, and actually in early February 1915 conduct an assault crossing on the Suez Canal with company and battalion-sized units. If your opponent has the will, and means to do that kind of operation, even though it was defeated, they may not be the walkover that you're thinking. British strategic decision-making suffered from the product of, quote, contentious committee-based systems in which the members pursued service-centric agendas. The Army was pushing for one thing, the Navy was pushing for something else. This made for slow decision-making, which most often resulted in compromise. Admiral Fisher did not want to spare fleet minesweepers and more modern battleships and battlecruisers, which he insisted were needed for operations near the home island and the operations in the North Sea. But there were a number of pre-dreadnoughts built 1880s through 1905 that were getting ready to be scrapped. And in his communication back and forth, he says, we can lose up to 16 of these. If the key is, we just need to force the Dardanelles. Edward Erickson, an instructor at the Marine Corps Command and Staff College, said, quote, Britain had bound itself in a strategic policy formed by competing interests in the War Council. British strategic policy rested on the successful execution of low-cost, high-return, naval-only assault on the Dardanelles with the goal of knocking out Germany, one of Germany's allies. The War Council made choices based on availability of resources, the stalemate in France and Flanders, and the strong personalities on the War Council. Thus, the Dardanelles campaign was ill-conceived and under-resourced. It was hoped that forcing the... well, we've already talked about that. Initially, Carden's forces were supported by Royal Navy bases in Alexandria and Malta. Now, the British had signed an agreement with the Greeks so that they could use the island of Lemnos off the Greek coast. It's 60 miles west of the strait. But there's a nice port there, deep enough for fleet operations. But the problem is, the port there, a small village, one pier. If you're going to use it as your prime advanced staging base for a sizable expeditionary force, you're going to really need to build up that base. And if you want to read about a very interesting, very competent naval officer, Rear Admiral Rosslyn Wemyss or Wemyss, Rosalind Wemyss, he arrived to become base commander and supervise those construction procedures. Did a fantastic job. Now, Carden, the problem is, you see over and over again, senior leaders in the Navy and the Army are given tasks, and they don't have trained staffs, so these generals or admirals are having to do these things themselves in a very quick turnaround. Carden, in February, is given the directive, okay, come up with a plan. And so he comes up with a 7-stage plan. We'll reduce the entrance forts, reduce the defenses further up the Narrows, clear the minefields, reduce the forts above the Narrows, and once we have control of the Dardanelles for safe access, we'll move into the Sea of Marmara and conduct operations off of Constantinople. He envisioned in these 7 stages, a slow, methodical advance that will demoralize the Turks. He envisioned an advance and clearing of defenses of 1 mile a day. It's a 50-mile area. Now, one of the things I neglected to mention, back on November 3rd, the previous year, before Britain had declared war on the Ottoman Empire, Churchill was upset after the Geffen had gone into the Black Sea and shelled the Russians, some Russian base facilities around the Black Sea. And so on November 3rd, Churchill had ordered a bombardment of the forts at the entrance to the Dardanelles. What that basically did was gave up the element of strategic surprise. Once that bombardment happens on the 3rd, von Usedom's engineers, they add 5 more lines of mines. They basically doubled the size of their minefield. They added more searchlights on both shores, really improved the defenses. And in the operational art, time is one of those factors that sometimes favors one side over the other. And time and again, no pun intended, in this campaign, the British fritter away time, much to the detriment of their prospects. Michael Forrest, in his 2012 book, The Defense of the Dardanelles, writes, "The expectation that purely naval action would be successful was simplistic and naive, particularly when the British intelligence sources had always indicated that a combined Army and Navy operation was required to secure the Dardanelles. The intelligence estimates have been forwarded through channels 1883, 1886, 1906, but when the War Council had been contemplating, should we do this or not, Colonel Hankey on the War Council had distributed the 1906 report that said, this won't work. And they still ignored it. Now, in the 1990 book, Military Misfortunes, The Anatomy of Failure in War, Elliot Cohen and John Gooch had theorized that the primary reasons why militaries fail are failure to learn the correct lessons, failure to anticipate, and failure to adapt. And in the first few months of the war, Churchill had noted how the German howitzers, heavy howitzers, had demolished the Belgian forts around Liège and up at Antwerp. And in selling the Dardanelles campaign, he goes, well, just picture our naval vessels as that kind of artillery support and we'll smash the forts. This is an example of learning the wrong lesson. Naval guns, as was said in one of the earlier talks, have a very flat trajectory. Howitzers, plunging fire. So the type of engagement he was thinking would demolish the opponent, he wasn't going to get that sort of outcome using the weapon systems that he had. Plus those another book, Robin Pryor, Gallipoli, The End of the Myth, has a very interesting section in it in which he talks about the type of naval bombardment it would have taken to actually hit the targets and then actually have a destruction result against them. These guns on these pre-dreadnoughts were worn out by this time. They had orders, don't do a battery fire, don't salvo fire. You'll destroy the guns. They're so worn out. They're so worn out, the best way to think about it is you're not hitting a point target. Think of an area box a couple hundred yards wide by 400 yards deep, and your shells will fall somewhere in there. And Pryor, in his book, Gallipoli, The End of the Myth, actually does a great calculation that the British dreadnoughts had basically a 1.5% chance of hitting what they were firing at. One of the ships that goes along on the expedition, the Queen Elizabeth, this was its teething outing. It had new 15-inch guns, super battleship, and we'll go test how the 15-inch guns of the Queen Elizabeth work. Well, even its guns, Pryor calculates, had about a 3% chance of hitting. So, one of the things that in the historiography that are talked about, well, maybe the Navy didn't have enough ammunition to support the kind of bombardment that was needed, tens of thousands of shells. But Erickson and a few others have looked at the archives, and all these battleships had full magazines that they could have done the firing, but to fire the number of shells that would have been required would have destroyed these guns. The British Navy at the time had the ability to do liners in the tubes that could be replaced, but these were old ships that were just going to be scrapped, so they weren't going to just do that with these types of guns. Now, we've talked about the defenses again. Let's skip. Okay. For gunfire spotting, the British sent the Ark Royal, as was talked about earlier, a seaplane carrier that the planes didn't take off from it. They were lifted onto the water and took off, did their spotting mission, and then came back and were hoisted back aboard. The problem with these early planes, one, it's a very hot operating environment. There's problems with lift. These engines on these early seaplanes, very underpowered. So, okay, we're going to take in the initial bombardment of the forts in mid-February, when they put the seaplanes into the water to go spot for the battleships, they couldn't take off. That's a problem. Sometimes they had a problem getting lift off the water. Another problem, a lot of these ships, or a lot of these aircraft rather, didn't have radios. What they found during the campaign, when you mounted a radio in one of these, it weighed the aircraft down so much that you couldn't get a high enough ceiling to be at a proper altitude for spotting and observing. Plus, you were well within the range of ground fire. And the Germans, when they start doing their operations, basically can change to night operations because their planes are coming back with too many holes from rifles. They're so low. The planes that did have radios didn't work. In their wisdom, they sent radio sets to the expedition, and they didn't have mechanics or spare parts for them. Big problem. The other aspect, okay, if we don't have a radio, or the radio's not functioning, I've observed the target over here. I will then fly back to the ship, get my waterproof pouch, put the message of where the enemy is, drop it in the waterproof pouch, and a small boat from the ship will retrieve the pouch, take it up to the guns, and fire it. By the time you do that, the wind, the weather has changed, and so good luck hitting what you're aiming at. Minesweeping was another issue. that did not have adequate planning. The British planners, Admiral Sir Henry Jackson and Henry Oliver, discounted the difficulties of sweeping floating mines in the strait. It'd be carried out at night while warships suppressed batteries protecting minefields. Batteries protecting minefields were located behind ridges or in areas where the fire from flat trajectory couldn't hit them. Carden had originally requested, I need fleet minesweepers. 4 should do it. Well, that was denied. The whole expeditionary force, it's getting used to being denied at this point. Hamilton, when he and Brathwaite, his chief of staff, meet with Kitchener, we're going to need planes for spotting and reconnaissance. And Kitchener said, not a one. So that's why the Royal Flying Corps didn't support the operation, but the Royal Navy Air Service did end up supporting it. So instead of fleet minesweepers that were more capable, they ended up using North Sea fishing trawlers. These are manned by civilian crews, fishermen. They are capable of 4 to 5 knots. Now the current coming down the Dardanelles is 3 knots. Now that's without wind. You add wind to it, and there are many times when they do minesweeping that they never even reach the first mine line. And so that is a problem. To do the most difficult task in the campaign, you've assigned your least capable piece of equipment and least trained personnel to do that. There's an asymmetry there that's problematic. Now, the British Royal Navy, again and again, are fixated on bombarding the forts, not destroy. They fail to appreciate the real problem is going to be the minefields. They have no answer for these howitzer batteries that are mobile on the far sides of these hills. Even when they can get aircraft up to spot them, they can't hit them. So again and again, these civilians in these minesweepers are having shells come at them screaming that are really distracting, okay? and many times during their sweeping operations, at the end they get debriefed, and in the heat of battle, I'm not sure if we swept in that area or not. So it's very problematic. The bombardment starts February 19th. They have 2 or 3 days of operations, and then the weather. You're operating in winter. So they have a number of days where they can't operate because of gales. What initially works, they do manage in when the gales let up in late February, early March, they start landing small parties to demolish guns in these forts. Initially, no resistance, but after doing that a few times, once you repeat your tactics, when you repeat your tactics, you establish patterns, patterns get people killed. There's stronger defensive reaction by the Turks. Now, fast forward to the March 18th assault. The March 18th assault comes along because the British had switched tactics a number of times. Okay, daylight, minesweeping's not working, we'll switch to night. Then they can't track where the heck they swept. Okay, we'll change tactics on the minesweeping again. Instead of sweeping up current, where we never reach the minefields, we'll go as far as we can and then turn around and sweep down current. Well, this would be conducted by 3 sets of 2 trawlers, a couple hundred yards apart, with a cable between them, and you'd snag, the cable would cut the mine mooring line, and the mine would float to the surface. You destroy it by a small gun in these small boats, or small arms fire. Sometimes as your learning curve develops, your idea doesn't work though. An example, one of the minesweepers makes it all the way, starts sweeping down current, and one of the mines they snagged then comes up and hits it on their stern, blowing their stern off, sinking them. So, you know, each time they try to adjust their tactics, it's problematic. Churchill isn't impressed with the slow progress they're making, so we need to have an all-out naval assault. And the all-out naval assault on the 18th, we're going to have several lines of ships. They're going to bombard these forts for a few hours, bring forth the minesweepers to help when these other lines of ships have bombarded the defenses. And then that's day one. Day two, after these forts are silenced, we'll be able to successfully conduct minesweeping. The problem, as I just stated, when you repeat tactics, the enemy can pick up on that. And the enemy had noted when they were bombarding these forts, they had a tendency to retire into Iroquois Bay and then withdraw out of the area. So on the night of March 8th, the Turks sent a mine layer, the Nusrat, to lay a row of mines that was perpendicular to the other mines. This line, 26 mines, about 100 yards apart, was here so that if they did the same tactic, they would run into that line of mines. Very astute observation of the Turks to turn a tactic of their opponent against them. Now, before this attack happens, Carden, you know, Churchill had said to Fisher, and Fisher was all in agreement, we could lose 16 ships as long as we clear the mines. Carden, the admiral, wasn't on board with that. It's like, he was freaking out. If I lose any of my ships, it'll be the end. So before, right before, 2 or 3 days before the March 18th assault, Carden has a nervous breakdown, and his second in command, Admiral de Robeck, takes over. Now, the day of the attack, the bombardment is moving forward, and as the afternoon progresses, the French, the Submarine goes over a mine and detonates and sinks really quickly. And then, in very quick succession, 2 other British ships also hit mines. The Irresistible is one of those ships. It has to be abandoned. And it sinks in the overnight hours. So, as a result of this failed attack, 3 battleships, the French Submarine and 2 British battleships are sunk, and another 3 ships are damaged and have to go to Malta for repairs. After the assault, After the assault, Churchill and Commodore Keyes wanted to renew the attack. Commodore Keyes said, "Okay, we'll put minesweeping gear on our destroyers. That'll take a few days." But de Robeck is a defeated person, and he goes, "No, we need to bring in the army and conduct land operations." So again, you're losing time as a factor. Now, one of the things I'd like to cover, submarine operations in the Dardanelles. The British submarines, as was mentioned in earlier talks, want to move into the Sea of Marmara because it's a much shorter distance to move supplies from Constantinople across the Sea of Marmara to the little village port of Gallipoli, then to take a long way around, 160 miles of railway, and then 100-mile one road down into the peninsula. That's a long supply line, so the British realized if we can cut their movement of supplies across that waterway, it'll really adversely impact their ability to conduct defensive operations. An example of
just hit next or previous. The top, yeah.
Here we go. Lieutenant Commander M.E. Naismith commanded the E-11. The E-11 had 3 very successful patrols in the Sea of Marmara. Once the British submarines started doing successful operations in that waterway, the Turks decide to keep their ships very close to shore because they don't have the ships to lose. They figure if they get hit, we'll raise them, salvage them, and keep using them. The E-11's first patrol, he's operating off of Constantinople and misses a torpedo attack. A torpedo attack against a ship misses. Luckily, he did miss because that particular ship was carrying a lot of women and civilians. It wasn't a troop ship, it was a passenger ship. Well, after the Turkish ship moved away, because the British subs have so few torpedoes, he goes, we need to recover that torpedo. And so he strips off his clothes, dives in, and that's when he realizes that the torpedo had actually hit the ship, smashed in its head, and the firing pin was 1/4 of an inch from the mercury fulminate detonator. So he unscrews the firing pin, and there in the Sea of Marmara, they rig a derrick that's used for loading torpedoes, and they rig a sling, and they get this torpedo back up into the sub and make it operational again. Now, 3 days later, he's attacking another ship. Again, the torpedo doesn't kill the ship. So, once again, goes and recovers the torpedo. The interesting thing, they come up with a different method this time. This time, they bring the stern tube so that 6 of his enlisted soldiers, sailors, go overboard, guide the head of the torpedo into the stern tube so it's facing the wrong way. Then they take the water out of the tube, and the vacuum sucks the torpedo into the tube. They close the outer door and then evacuate all the water from the tube, open the inner door, and move the torpedo in the stern that's facing forward into the sub. There's an overhead rail that goes from the stern of the sub to the bow, and everybody lay ho, heave. They move the torpedo from the stern to the bow, put it in one of the bow tubes, and for all of their persistence, a few days later on August 3rd, they do manage to get a kill with that, their last. So, persistence, thy name, is the crew of the E-11. Now, as if that's not enough excitement for that patrol, on the way back through, heading out of Sea of Marmara down through the strait, the commander realizes they've snagged a torpedo on let me get the right, one of the forward hydroplanes. He realizes that the mine is above the hydroplane, the cable's still attached, and the sinker is below the hydroplane. And it's within 10 feet of the sub. And it's one of those horned things where it's, the horns are soft lead, there's a glass vial in there. If it bumps against the hull of the sub, the lead crushes, the glass crushes, the electrolyte, you create the circuit, and the 80 pounds of explosive go boom. With this mine hanging on above his hydroplane, he goes down the full length, gets through the minefield, goes down the full length of the strait, surfaces out at the end of the peninsula, and makes sure that his stern's higher than his bow, and he backs out away from it. When that happens, the sinker drops. They mark it as a mine there, and now the German subs, we've talked about. Okay, U-21. Well, first of all, I want to hit a few more points, so bear with me. The Germans wanted to send UB and UC boats down, but before Bulgaria entered on their side, you couldn't send it by rail, so and the Austrians wouldn't help. So they disassembled these UB and UC class boats, sent them to Austria. It would take 14 days to reassemble, and then they'd sell them down to the Dardanelles. They eventually used both of those boats in the Black Sea in operations against the Russians. Last night's presentation we heard about Otto Herzing, a very competent U-boat officer. In April of 1915, he gets approval from the Kaiser, take your U-21 down to the Gallipoli area of operations. Instead of going through the North Sea minefields, he goes all the way around Scotland. And because of some maintenance, mechanical issues with bad fuel, he has to spend a lot of his time on the surface. And so he actually transits through the Straits of Gibraltar on the surface. And staying as close as he can to the African shore. Once he gets to operating offshore the Dardanelles, the British battleships are off the coast where they're providing fire support. And on May 25th, he surfaces, or not surfaces, pardon me, he works with submerged within about 300 yards of the Triumph, torpedoes it with one torpedo, and aggressively, foolishly, takes his sub in a direct line following the torpedo track under the sinking Triumph, you know, right before it turns turtle, rolls over and sinks. Then spends 28 hours submerged, trying to avoid the escorts. Comes back up, no battleships are around. He then tries to scout around, does find another ship, the Majestic, on the 27th, and doesn't get as close this time. Instead of a 300-yard shot, he only manages to get within 700 yards, torpedoes it, and is rewarded with another sinking. That aggressiveness, sinking 2 British battleships in a 3-day span, the Admiralty freaks out, and they withdraw all their supporting battleships from fire support to spending the rest of the campaign in harbor at Imbros and Lemnos. So what's going to provide fire support? Because at this stage, in May, you've got the British land forces that need fire support. All those British divisions on the peninsula had far less artillery than their counterparts on the Western Front. The British generals at this time think that all you need is, more artillery will equal success. So if you withdraw the big guns, the battleships, what do you end up supporting them with, the troops with? And the answer, monitors. Monitors are very simply a cheap, fast to build, big gun asset. Low freeboard, one turret, usually 12 inches, 14-inch guns, sometimes a secondary armament. And they were quick to build, and they're not as heavily armored as a battleship, so it's that heavy fire support, but not the expense. And so a number of 14-inch monitors, 12-inch monitors, and some smaller ones, 9.2-inch, are sent as quickly as they're built down to support operations. This is an interesting photo because it's one of the older pre-dreadnoughts that's being phased out, the Lord Nelson, with the new, cheaper substitutes. Now, effectiveness of the monitor gunnery, it varied. I'm going to find the quote. Yes. One of the aerial observers said of the Abercrombie, one of the monitors' accuracy, lauding it as, quote, the best shooting monitor out here. While the Raglan, the monitor pictured here, drew less favorable praise. One of the other Navy officers regarding the Raglan's gunnery accuracy said, quote, Raglan, in his usual inconsequential fashion, dropped a half-dozen shells anywhere on the same continent as the Prithia village target. So that's not really high praise. Now, a couple notes on air operations that I want to in addition to the Ark Royal, there are a number of other seaplane carriers, the Ben Cree that was talked about earlier, and you have other assets. The kite balloons were used. Of course, the British had picked up, that the kite balloons with their fins are much more stable, easier to operate. And were very useful for spotting. One of the kite balloon ships, this is the Manica, paired up with the Queen Elizabeth's 15-inch guns before it's withdrawn, and does really, really competent observation and forward observation for the guns. Now, this is some Farman MF-27s. The 27 is a variant of the Farman MF-20, just with the Salmson 9 engine, and some Newports operating from Tenedos. One of the things that you see in the early operations, hey, we've got these nice short 184 planes. What would happen if we put torpedoes on them and went against the shipping in the Sea of Marmara? Well, the problem is that's right at the max range of those short 184s. So on the very first time they tried this, Lieutenant Flight Commander Charles Edmonds told his observer, you can't come with. It's either you or the torpedo, and I'm choosing the torpedo. And so his first attempt on August 12th, he manages to sink a ship. It's later determined that that ship had been beached from an earlier submarine attack by the E-14. But 5 days later, he gets another opportunity. And on August 17th, gets another kill with an aerial torpedo. The person that I really admire, though, is another aviator from the Ben Cree that we don't hear about, but his name was Flight Lieutenant George Bentley Doctrine. And Doctrine, in trying to torpedo a Turkish vessel in False Bay is hit by ground fire, and he's got problematic engines on his short 184, so he has to land on the water. Well, in the meantime, he sees this Turkish tugboat vessel near him, and he can't get his plane back up in the air. So, very adaptive, he steers his float plane on the surface of the water and points it toward the tugboat and fires his torpedo from the surface and gets a torpedo kill as a surface-launched torpedo attack by a short 184 seaplane. Very, very adaptive. And then after hitting that ship, he still has problems getting the engine in a state where it provides lift, and he taxis to try to take off. It takes him almost a 2-mile taxi run on the surface of the water to get going. Now, I just want to share those stories with you. The Germans, they're trying to, in talking about the Ottoman air service, there is a German army officer named Cerno, and Oberleutnant Erich Cerno. He's released from the Prussian army, attached to the German military mission in Constantinople, and he's given the orders, proceed down there, you're to begin the Ottoman air service, you're in charge of it. One thing, you don't have mechanics, you don't have spare parts. So you're going to hire local artisans and teach them how to make spare parts and then be mechanics. So he's got quite a challenge ahead of him. When they do start getting German aircraft, they start to conduct missions. They do some bombing missions against Tenedos with 22-pound bombs, not creating a lot of damage. But the thing is about the air operations that I want you to understand. If it hadn't been for the aerial observation, a lot of people argue, R.D. Lehman argued in his book on naval aviation in the First World War, that the Turks might have overrun the Allied positions on the peninsula because they were able to spot troop concentrations and try to direct fire to them before they actually happened. Now, lessons learned, finishing up. Thank you for your patience. Erik Erikson concludes, numerous disasters befell the Allied forces in the Gallipoli campaign. British decision makers in the War Council were determined to conduct a campaign against the Ottoman Empire on the cheap and refused to send first-line assets to the Mediterranean. This was compounded by a lack of strategic clarity that was brought about by ambiguity, how to balance ends, ways, and means. The failure to apply overwhelming force became a main reason for campaign failure. It was a peripheral campaign until June 1915, then it becomes Britain's main effort. The War Council failed to resource the campaign properly. Now, the Dardanelles Commission report that comes out in 1917 basically in its conclusion said, quote, we think that when it was decided to undertake an important expedition, sufficient consideration was not given to the measures necessary to carry out such an expedition with success. We think the difficulties of the operation were much underestimated. The shore bombardment in November 14 gave the Turks warning of an attack, and naval operations led naturally to a great strengthening of the Turkish defenses. The Turks were known to be led by German officers. There was no reason to think that they would not fight well, especially in defensive positions. We're of the opinion that with the resources then available, success, if possible, was only possible upon condition that the government concentrated their efforts upon the enterprise and limited their expenditure of men and materials in other theaters. This didn't happen. Now, strategic lessons learned. If there was a possibility of conducting an operation against an enemy weakness, it's generally inadvisable to bring attention to that weakness beforehand. Thus, don't do a short 20-minute bombardment and then do nothing else for 3 months afterwards. Operational lessons learned. When operating in mined waters, one should not discount the fear that surrounds these operations. Commodore Keyes said, "I did not think fire from concealed howitzer and field guns would ever be a decisive factor. I was wrong. The fear of their fire was actually the deciding factor. Ways and means must be properly aligned with ends, if ends are to be reached at a minimum cost. The ends are your strategic goals, the ways are your tactics, the means are your equipment." As the Dardanelles Commission asked in its final report, how can a fleet take a peninsula? How can it occupy Constantinople? The British applied their least capable set of assets, the fishing trawlers, turned to minesweepers manned by civilian crews, against the most difficult part of the campaign, clearing minefields under fire. So the asymmetric mismatch. Operational art consists of space, time, and force factors, and in the case of closing a maritime strait, those factors tend to favor the actor attempting to close it. The straits have reduced maneuver room. The Allies repeated tactics that the Turks observed. The Allies continually sacrificed the element of time, allowing the Turks and Germans to improve their defenses. Quality leadership is critical. Carden was described by contemporaries as, quote, a very second-rate, no-go in him, no ideas, no initiative type of officer. Admiral Fisher commented during the campaign that, quote, he had the sort of feeling that the thing was too much for Carden, end of quote. But, seniority, you get what instead of competence. In kinetic warfare, learning may not be fast enough. As they adapted, daytime, nighttime, etc., up current, down current, their learning curve was too slow. And a common understanding of risk across echelons is critical. Commodore Keyes didn't understand why the civilian trawler crewmen didn't want to hang in there and sweep mines while they were being bombarded by howitzers. Churchill didn't understand, well, we could have lost 16 of these ships. Why didn't they really commit to it? Michael Hickey said that there's 9 requirements for successful amphibious operations. Now, were these criteria met in planning? No. Those criteria: sound, unambiguous political and strategic direction, well-practiced joint staff procedures, adequate weapon systems and munitions, thorough attention to logistics, reliable intel, account for a good assessment of the enemy's capabilities, and an appreciation of the geographic factors. Those all go into good, sound, amphibious warfare staff planning procedures. They really didn't happen in these cases. And if you want to read more about it, Pritzker Military Museum Library. We have 51,000 books, 33 different languages. We send interlibrary loan all throughout the US and Canada. Our catalog is on our website, pritzkermilitary.org. We're happy to send the items out to you. 3-week loan period here in Illinois, 4 to 6 week loan period outside of Illinois. If you want to learn more, go to pritzkermilitary.org, our website. We have a number of World War I posters digitally online. You can search our online catalog, interlibrary loan. As part of the World War I Centennial Commission, we do webcasts, author events, panel discussions. At the end of this month, we have a new Alvin York program. There's a new biography written by an Army colonel. He's going to be there. We webcast them live. So 6 o'clock Central, just tune in and enjoy our program. Thank you.
The naval guns always shot on a fairly flat trajectory. Do you think if they would be like the modern battleships where they could elevate 40 degrees and use plunging fire from a distance, do you think that would have made a difference on the forts?
Maybe. There's a great book we have in our holdings called Big Gun Monitors about their development. And there's some great photos in Big Gun Monitors where they show the ships heeled to an angle where one side is deeper in the water than the other to get that additional elevation. It was like an expedient, well, we'll try this and see what happens. But
they didn't have the spotting anyway.
They had bad maps. Now, what's interesting, by 1917, 1918, they did, on the Belgian coast, they had done a great job on the Belgian coast of like creating a grid square to coordinate call for fire procedures between the supporting naval gunships and the targets, and they'd actually mapped out, specific targets. But there was a disconnect between seeing where you wanted to hit and actually hitting it.
Okay. Next, you have a question.
Yes. How many mines did the Turks lay, and how many were destroyed?
I think it was 387 in the 11 lines, and before the March 18th battle, the British destroyed 6 of the 387. In fact, that perpendicular mine line, the British had actually found 3 mines in that line 2 days before the March 18th attack and hadn't put 2 and 2 together. So, they had such a difficulty reaching the lines against the current that it was a circular problem. They needed to clear the mines, but in order to clear the mines, they needed to have the mobile howitzer batteries on the far sides of the hills stop their interdicting fire, and they never could solve the howitzer problem to get, at the mines.
Any other questions? Yes.
Yes, sir.
One of the unresolved questions from my talk was whether the Turkish Navy had naval seaplanes operating during the time of the Gallipoli campaign. I wasn't able to figure that out during my quick attempt to summarize it. Do you happen to know?
The initial, thank you for the question. The initial group that went down with the officer that starts the Ottoman Air Service, there's a number of rumplers that Wasserflieger Abteilung that starts with the Gotha WD-1, WT-2. They initially are using German civilian pilots and German civilian mechanics as a stopgap. Once the rail line to Bulgaria opens up through Bulgaria, their parts and other issues start to resolve themselves. I cannot, to answer your question, I cannot find evidence that there were Turk crewmen, aviators, or Turk planes during the length of the campaign, February 15 through January 16. Like you said, the Turks do make an appearance in 16, but not during this campaign.
Thank you. Another question that was up a minute ago. Yes.
You talked about the UBs. The UBs were the primary submarine that the Germans used in Constantinople because, like you say, they could break down into 5 parts and be shipped by rail. So that there were about 5 that were shipped that way. I think 7 actually that were in Constantinople. And one of them sank the British submarine.
Yes.
And the other thing is, your friend Naismith was one of 4 Victoria Crosses given to British submariners.
The reason that the German UB-14 was able to sink the E-20 was a French sub a few days previous had been damaged and scuttled and captured, but they didn't destroy the orders book. And the Germans were able to exploit that intelligence, and the E-20 was to have rendezvoused with the E-14. And when the E-20 shows up, the sub that he thinks is the E-14 is actually the UB-14 and puts a torpedo in him and sinks him. But yeah, it's amazing that the Germans in both World War I and World War II did that. Okay, we'll break down subs into 3 pieces and ship them and then reassemble them. Doing that successfully as a stopgap. But the last thing about the Sea of Marmara, it's so small you can sail across it in one day, and so it becomes increasingly challenging for the British to avoid observation as the Ottomans and Germans add their own submarines into the Sea of Marmara, and those anti-submarine patrols by the German float planes, seaplanes.
Yes, please.
Is it true that one of the British submarines was abandoned and there was a campaign to take it out of the Turkish hands, and they actually wound up using small boats to blow that up?
Very early,
Were two brothers involved?
very early in the campaign, the I forget the E number on it, but in there are a number of French and British subs that in the Narrows there, they were always running into rocks and things on that their charts didn't show, and would be trapped on shoals and attract artillery fire. And as you said, this was over a period of, it was very quick turnaround time, less than 36 hours from the time that the British realized, oops, there's this sub out there that we need to destroy it, and they send other subs, no. They send destroyers, no. They try to bomb it, no. They try to hit it with battleship guns, no. Finally, small boats from a couple of the battleships go all the way up the Dardanelles on their own, and with the torpedoes, these small launches actually end up torpedoing it and sinking it.
Any other questions? I have one question. It was at this battle, and I think at that times, that both Fisher and Churchill had their final departure for each other. What did that more than anything else?
Well, you have to remember, Admiral Fisher was in his early 70s, 73. He didn't have the patience. He had threatened to resign well over a dozen times, and they have to talk him off the ledge and come back to need you. Churchill had a force of will, a way of carrying himself, either in one-to-one meetings or in the War Council, that drove everybody else nuts. And he had a way of using language to guilt you into having it done his way. But a lot of it deals with Churchill was so determined, we got to do operations against the German islands or an amphibious landing in the Baltic against the North German plain, and Fisher and the Admiralty are like, you're nuts. So there's this mental disconnect on how to break the stalemate that had developed on the Western Front, and they were not going to come to a meeting of the minds.
And that brought, but Fisher actually, they couldn't find him after he retired. I mean, he resigned. In fact, they found him drunk, I think, in a hotel.
Yeah.
Is that not correct?
I believe so, sir.
Yeah, that's all right. All right. The program is not over. We're taking a break. I want to thank you all.